broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on a shared approach to BIBFRAME implementation. I'm Erin Elsie, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Jackie Samples and Ian Bigelow. Jackie is the head of the Metadata and Discovery Strategy Department at Duke University Libraries. She currently leads the Share-VDE Transformation Council. Ian is the cataloging coordinator at the University of Alberta Libraries. He is currently a member of the Canadian Committee on Cataloging, Canadian BIBFRAME Readiness Task Force, PCC Linked Data Advisory Committee, and the Share-VDE Transformation Council, and chair of the Share-VDE Work Identifier Working Group. Both Jackie and Ian bring much expertise to today's topic, and we're fortunate to have them with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Jackie and Ian, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now we'll turn it over to start with Jackie. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello. Thanks for the introduction and the description of how the webinar is going to work. I'm really excited to see how many people are interested in this topic and register for today's event. So this is briefly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to give an overview of the Share-VDE project and its history. And then along with that, the ongoing work of the Transformation Council. And a particular focus will be made on the development of BIBFRAME through SVDE in relation to other projects, such as initiatives at LC, LD4P, and the PCC. So what is Share-VDE anyway? It's not exactly a well-known acronym yet, but it's the community-driven initiative to implement linked data by transitioning GLAM institutions' metadata into the BIBFRAME ontology and framework. Share-VDE is also a virtual discovery platform with a 4-layered adaptation of the BIBFRAME data model. The platform was developed to provide a linked data discovery option. There are 6 main areas of focus for the project, and these are the enrichment of marked records with URIs, conversion from MARC to RDF using the BIBFRAME vocabulary, and using other ontologies as needed or requested. The data publication according to the BIBFRAME data model, that one's pretty obvious, I think. We're also focusing on batch and automated data updating procedures and batch or automated data dissemination to libraries functionalities. And we're also progressively implementing new and future use cases in the order that the community defines for itself. The Share-VDE is a very collaborative endeavor, and it's based on requirements and perceptions of libraries and library-like institutions, but it was developed by Castellini Libri, who most of you probably have heard of. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had a slight technological problem with the sound. Going to talk about this slide again. So Kathleen Libri, who you most of you probably know of, was a driver in this endeavor, as was ALCTS, which is a provider of ILS discovery tools and semantic web tech solutions for cultural heritage sectors, those GLAM institutions I mentioned earlier. And of course, it's also gotten a lot of input and active participation from an international group of 22 research libraries, and was influenced by the vision of the LD4P initiative. But this whole collaboration is steered by the member library community. Here's a list of the participating institutions. There's a couple layers of membership that one might engage in. So we have full members, which are listed here, and an LD4P cohort group, which is listed in the other column. And we're strategizing and working on making the community broader. So there's work ongoing with some European institutions. I found out this morning that our newest full member is the National Library of Norway, who joined earlier this month, and so we want to welcome them to the community too. The Share-VDE has gone through about 2.5 phases so far. Worked through the first 2 phases, culminated in the creation of an experimental linked data discovery environment, and also the return of collections data from participating institutions in a MARC enriched file with URIs, and then the same data again in BIBFRAME. And prior to the creation of the Transformation Council, work was driven, or the use cases were driven by the member libraries through ongoing discussions and use case design meetings that happened at the Library of Congress at the Share-VDE annual meeting, and in LD4P workshops, and also at the European BIBFRAME conference. So as you saw on the last slide, 2019 began with the production phase of the project, which meant that a lot of discussion both for and by libraries took place. The 4 deliverables were identified in a use case designing portion of phase 3, and they're listed here. I mentioned them earlier as well, but I just wanted to point out that they are still in progress, and that means that not all of the data sets have been processed, and not all of the data sets have been returned to each of the member libraries. So some libraries have had the full set of records returned to them. And I wanted to go over a little bit more of the overview of the workflow. And it's pretty complicated, as you can see from this illustration. It's taken a while to create this pretty effective workflow model, though. But it is a complex network of both human and computer processing, which includes matching headings to authority data, entity detection and clustering, reconciliation of those aspects of the processing, and then the creation of a database of relationships between entities, such as persons, works, and publishers. Alongside this work, the data is enriched with URIs from several sources, and then it is loaded into the RDF BibFrame dataset that's in the cloud, which can be accessed by the Share-VDE portal, so that it can be used as a discovery layer, which of course floats above the linked data part of the project. It might be easier for us to grasp the outcomes of the SVDE processes by looking at a data model or 2, maybe. This data model was conceived early on in the project, but this iteration was enhanced in February of this year to include a superwork concept. So as you can see here, the superwork links to entities and other superworks as well, allowing like resources to be clustered while providing granular enough data for the user to be able to choose the instance and items they are looking for. This is the entity model we're currently working in, and it's slightly more difficult to see because it's bigger. So it's what we're using right now, but of course, due to the changing nature of BIBFRAME and our interpretation of what a conversion should look like, the data model is continuing to evolve. The differences, some differences between this model and the previous one include a new agent cluster and a new publisher cluster, and some extra or additional granularity in the publisher data. And we also added a little bit more toward defining what we mean by the entities that are listed here. So we have work and BF work, so we can see the differences or maybe conceptualize the similarities. So along the lines of saying this data model is continuing to evolve, we have these two options of future data models. I know these are really tiny. I don't expect you to be able to or want to look at the close details, but I just wanted to show that we are, as a community, continuing to work on the model to make it as fluid and appropriate as possible for the most number of institutions possible, and to ensure that the data model is keeping up with changing thoughts and changing standards. So I'm going to move over into talking about the library communities, the BIBFRAME library communities. So as I said, and as you can tell, this is a very broad community, or sets of intersecting library communities, really, which are involved in the development and implementation of linked data in BIBFRAME. And so Share-VDE is now taking steps for further internationalization of both the community and the development of the tools, so that we can take, so that we, the community itself, can gain greater advantages of expertise and perspectives around the movement into BIBFRAME. And so as far as that goes, there are some national libraries that I don't have listed in the Venn diagram, but of course, in a sense, all of the BIBFRAME community is in the international BIBFRAME community bubble, as well as some of those other intersecting groups. So everybody's in the BIBFRAME community almost. But let's talk about a couple of the groups that are listed here. So as the PCC laid out in its 2018 strategic directions document, it is time to move beyond the theoretical level and into implementation for linked data, and to extend our community in order to successfully navigate the changing landscape of library metadata. So we took that as a moment where we needed to start moving forward. And I'm not going to read this long quotation, but you can see it in the strategic directions document if you'd like to. So I know you all probably know a lot about BIBFRAME by now. It started at the Library of Congress and had some community partners and collaborators back in 2011. It provides a foundation for the future of bibliographic description, both on and off the web. And it's helping us reconceptualize our descriptive metadata, what we need to do to move beyond records into statements and graphs. It's to make are rich bibliographic data, more useful within the library community and beyond. And it's based on linked data principles, which is, of course, important if you're trying to build a linked data vocabulary. So some concepts that are maybe a little bit different are the entities, attributes, and relationships. And the technologies are URIs and RDF. And almost, it seemed like almost immediately, but I know it was a few years, BIBFRAME 2.0 came out. And it has 3 core levels of extraction, but it's very similar to the original BIBFRAME model with some more granular definitions. So Share-VDE is going to work towards strengthening our interaction with the wider community and also to provide a level of leadership and coordination. So BIBFRAME is developed in a consistent way. The Transformation Council will begin making formal proposals for updating BIBFRAME to the Library of Congress instead of just among ourselves, I suppose, and for the community as well. Another community that is involved in a big way in linked data and BIBFRAME is the linked data for production. They've been working over the past several years to develop standards, creating end-to-end workflows, and extending the BIBFRAME ontology, as well as engaging in the broader library community to make sure that the decisions and the transformations that we are deciding on now are understood and sustainable at the same time, as well as flexible. So there are those. Sort of a category of LD4P is a new grant for LD4P Phase 2, which builds on the foundational work of linked data for production, Phase 1, and the linked data for library labs. So to also work towards implementing the implementation phase of cataloging, the shift of the cataloging community to linked data for the creation and manipulation of the metadata. Share-VDE has a key role for the LD4P cohort because it provides a consistent way for the provision of a highly reconciled pool of MARC production data, which was converted to RDF and can be used and is going to be used in the shared PCC triple store, and will be used in a newly created BIBFRAME editor called Sinopia. Sinopia is being built for the use of the LD4P member and cohort institutions. And this is a screenshot of what the linked data editor looks like, or this is what it looked like on Monday, but it's also evolving. The term Sinopia refers to the preliminary drawing for a fresco or a mural, and it's named for that reddish-brown pigment that has traditionally been used to draw or transfer those images. LD4P's Sinopia is also a preliminary step, a sketch of what's possible on the way to a full-fledged linked data production environment. So Sinopia is an environment where libraries can create metadata without having to set up and maintain their own tools to learn best practices related to linked data creation and to explore the idea of cooperative cataloging in the linked data environment, and as well as to contribute feedback and expertise for the iterative development of tools for working in a linked data environment. So not just its own environment, but for others as well. So finally getting to the Share-VDE Transformation Council, you can see our charge on the slide. The Transformation Council was developed after the Share-VDE workshop, which happened right before the ALA 2018 annual conference. And it was formed to undertake the review of the conversion of MARC 21 metadata to BIBFRAME 2.0. That's pretty much our entire charge. Almost immediately after was charged, the need for subgroups was recognized, and so charters and use cases were developed for those working groups. However, only the work identification working group was really formed and started to be productive immediately. Now all 4 of these working groups are underway. The UX UI working group was envisioned just before ALA Midwinter 2019, so they're pretty new, and they're working on what they need to work on. Ian will talk about that a little bit later. So I wanted to go over a little bit of what the conversion review process was like. It was fast. We started meeting in August, and we submitted our recommendations in November. But we did try to be as systematic as possible. We reviewed project partner reports which were written by the individual membership groups alone. Then we shared them with each other. Then we went and took an in-depth look at conversion documentation and used a BIBFRAME comparison tool. And then we tried to look at MARC and BIBFRAME RDF data side by side using a project-specific comparison tool as well, which was really effective, I think. But as I mentioned, we started in August and finalized our recommendations in November, so it was kind of a whirlwind, and we knew it was a first step review, not the final. In no way a final review or final set of recommendations. So what the Transformation Council ended up doing was to make 14 recommendations for changes and updates. 4 of the recommendations were quite general and are just supportive of collaboration and openness in order to promote a shared development environment. But the remaining 10 recommendations are less general and include sort of specific topics like the preferred sources for URIs. We defined a new concept of a super work, and we improved the conversion of the series edit title metadata. Those are just a few examples. We had quite a few more as well. Now I'm going to hand it over to Ian, who's going to discuss the more of the conversion process, as well as an overview of the working groups. Thanks, Ian.
Whoops, I think, can you redo the transition there? I think I grabbed the wrong one. Sorry, bear with me. Thanks for that, and sorry for the delay in changing slides. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now, and thank you, Jackie, for that coverage. And yeah, so now I'll dive in with some coverage of the work that's happened thus far with the various subgroups of the Share-VDE Transformation Council, starting with the Work ID working group. So at the LD4 workshop at Stanford University in May 2018, conversations identified the need for a group to work on refining the creation of work identifiers. For Share-VDE in specific, I suppose, but also more generally for BIBFRAME to achieve success in providing more universal identifiers for primary resource types. And when I'm talking throughout this about primary resource types, you can think about those sort of primary resources we often refer to in terms of like group 1 entities for Ferber. But in this case, we're talking about BIBFRAME, obviously, so super work, instance, item. And in the months following that meeting, members of the Work ID working group were identified from within stakeholder institutions and based on relevant experience of people who had expertise in the area. And we had an initial charge to review the Share-VDE work clustering outline. So from the initial phases of the project, some specifications have been made to create IDs to start with. And so we were charged with reviewing that and submitting feedback on potential improvements for optimization and so on. Reviewing the use of primary resource identifiers in Share-VDE in the data set and providing feedback, and engaging with the PCC to identify and or develop best practice for use of these identifiers in BIBFRAME and MARC data. And as analysis started, we quickly identified a few key areas for development. One was that other work URI vocabularies didn't really lend themselves to practical application in Share-VDE, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The existing clustering algorithm needed to be refined and adjusted to take MARC practice into account and to cover the identification of more work types, I guess, and work relationships. And we also wanted to create work identifiers that would be useful not just for the Share-VDE community, but the library community writ large. So we also wanted to think about sort of our approach and how we did that. And we, just by the nature of the process, we wanted to keep an open mind about the definition of a work and sort of how that was applied for Share-VDE. Okay. So this slide really is just to highlight that one of these things really is not like the other. On the left-hand side, you can see like a MARC view or librarian view from the University of Alberta's Blacklight instance. And on the right, there's the equivalent view of the BIBFRAME data from Share-VDE from a previous phase granted in our UIL's triple store that we've been using for testing. Just a visualization, I suppose, a visualization tool. We've been using GraphDB. And work on the analysis of Share-VDE data has really highlighted how different the data is and how relationships are made more explicit. Many of the concepts that have only really been theory for so long are now practical use cases that we need to resolve and really work on developing further. And incidentally, it's also kind of striking that there's really nowhere to hide in this data because all the relationships between various entities and so on are made so explicit that they really have to be accurate. So this is just an example from the Share-VDE portal showing one work sort of aggregating a number of different instances together for discovery purposes. And this is really fascinating in terms of what we can do with discovery environments that might go on, and I'll talk a little bit more about discovery shortly. But what's really critical here is that first, in order to enable this, we need to have work identifiers, and we need to work on a way to have them for everything. And so the challenge really became lots of work in a short period of time, because we needed to find a solution for this fairly quickly to make Share-VDE work. And this is just an example from MARC data that was converted to BIBFRAME using the Library of Congress XSLT. And the example that's shown here is one of the example.org sort of placeholder works that get assigned through that process. And you may ask yourself, what's the problem with this, and what is an example.org URI? And it does give a sort of a placeholder there, but it's not universally applicable. So you can ask yourself, what happens if you load a new version of your data, or if you add onto it, or for that matter, if you want to connect collections between your institution and a number of other different ones. And the issue then becomes that there'll be a lot of duplication, and it becomes somewhat problematic. So we needed to work out something a little bit more universal. So we did look at existing vocabularies. One of the primary ones we looked at was the OCLC work identifiers, and there were some challenges with that in terms of technical methods for enrichment of the SVDE data. Part of that being just the sort of the enrichment process on such a large scale, but also institutional memberships, looking at different international institutions that are sort of member of Share-VDE. There's also the question of definition with OCLC using schema.org. And while OCLC has done a number of different presentations on the work IDs, getting down to a level of the algorithms and how they create those identifiers, it would be nice to have that outlined a little bit more clearly. to create those relationships within the SVDE data. And at the time that we were doing that investigation, OCLC works were still considered experimental as well. I know that there's been a change to that more recently. So this is something that could be exciting as a next step for enrichment for Share-VDE data. And it would also be really interesting to compare approaches and come to a standard for the creation of primary resource identifiers through automated or algorithmic processes. Because there's got to be only so many ways that you can pull apart a MARC record to create these, using these algorithms to create the identifiers. So to come to a general community standard or best practice for doing that for BIBFRAME would be really nice. One of the other ones that we looked at was the sort of the approach of the Library of Congress. And two of the key ways that they've been working on it is creating work URIs based on LCCN and also making use of named title authorities. And these are great, but again, in terms of universal applicability, looking at an international scale of things, not all institutions will have LCCNs for all the works that are outlined in a given MARC record. Similarly, there's not a named title authority for all those the works that are outlined in various descriptions. But again, it would be something to look at as a possible next step. So what are we talking about, or what am I talking about when I say, more universal applicability? So what we're hoping for is to have identifiers that can be used for the library community as a whole. The cluster knowledge base that's one of the results from the Share-VDE project is supposed to be made open to the general library community, not just SVDE members. So that's something to think about. So we need to have a universal applicability that way. And so we want to also have open definitions for these things. This is something that Share-VDE still needs to work on. I hope maybe this presentation will help with that a little bit. But we do intend to put out a white paper sometime soon. That's generally, I think, waiting on Jackie and I to get organized, to have the time to put into putting something together, but to sort of outline the various definitions and how the various work identifiers and so forth are actually created, amongst other things. So one of the things that we really needed to think about for the work of the work ID group was some of the various definitions that currently exist. And BIBFRAME, defines the work as the highest level of abstraction. Work in the BIBFRAME context reflects the conceptual essence of the cataloged resource. And there's differences in definition from BIBFRAME to LRM to Ferber and so on. And this has been a subject of discussion for some time. But the work ID group needed a practical solution in a short period of time. And as I sort of tried to outline, we wanted to keep an open mind about the definition of work, sort of focusing on use and how it would work out in Share-VDE. And one of the significant outcomes from that work was the creation of this new superwork class in Share-VDE. And thanks Jackie, she already sort of gave an overview of the model. But the creation of the superwork was really based on two arguments to a degree. One was that while work to expression relationships can currently be expressed in BIBFRAME, the expression of and so forth built between works, these are currently ultimately work-to-work relationships, and determining that an initial or primary work, or for that matter, hierarchical relationships between works may prove difficult with that structure. This might not be quite so challenging if we're thinking about sort of the creation of original data in BIBFRAME, where it's a bit easier for the cataloger, say, to create those relationships from one to another, though there's still perhaps some conceptual reasons why that would be problematic. But if you're thinking about sort of the conversion of MARC data to BIBFRAME, this becomes a little bit problematic because you need to have a way to identify which ones are which and how to then identify the relationship from one to another. So through the conversion from MARC to BIBFRAME, or I guess potentially looking at automatic work ID generation based on BIBFRAME elements, unless we can define a difference, a fingerprint per se, for each cluster or constellation between work and superwork elements, then those relationships, what you think about between work and expression in Ferber, for instance, cannot be captured through conversion or automated processing. And with the scale of data conversion underway, not doing this would seem like a missed opportunity. And then once we sort of created those fingerprints or definitions in terms of what the difference was between the primary and secondary works, we needed to have something to call it. There's been other definitions of superwork in the past, and so we coined it the Share-VDE superwork. Okay. So in the Share-VDE context, a work is we define it as such that it's equivalent to a BIBFRAME work, but it's no longer the highest level of abstraction. Identifiers for SVDE work are created algorithmically based on unique constellations of elements for BIBFRAME works. And the types of SVDE works and the definitions for which elements are used in its creation are outlined in the work ID cluster mapping, which I'll give you an example of that in a second. Similarly, the SVDE superwork is now considered the highest level of abstraction in Share-VDE, but in sort of function, it works as a subclass of BIBFRAME work and is meant to aggregate or group functional linear equivalents of BIBFRAME work clusters. And similarly, the identifiers are created based on algorithms, on algorithmic processes. So through the process of doing this, we identified a number of different superwork and work types that can be extracted from MARC data. Outlined here is just a snapshot of a few of these in what we refer to as the work ID cluster mapping document. And you note here there's links to further specifications to outline how that all works. And this is just a snapshot. This is one of the pieces we hope to outline in when we put out a white paper to outline how some of these things are defined, to give the specifics of how things are being pulled apart. And some may also note that this is a work in progress, so we expect to tweak this. And some of the clusters or some of the identifiers will have more confidence than others. We'll talk about that in a second too. In practical terms, in the data, the way that this works out is that some works are identified as a type superwork. Works have a designation -1 to indicate the difference between the two types. And you have the relationship has expression used from superwork to work and expression of to link from work to superwork in the RDF data. I talked about degrees of confidence. So one of the things that has been worked on in terms of giving us some tools to review some of this is having a bit of a back-end tool where they color code so that the confidence of how good the clusters might be. Doesn't mean to say that the ones that aren't green are wrong, but they might be based, say, on like 245 data and so forth, where the clusters might not be as strong and might need some review. So it'll be interesting to see as we get more data out to sort of review how well the clusters match to each other and so forth. And I wanted to include this slide again. I know Jackie covered it before, but just to say that this ultimately results in a new model for BIBFRAME data in Share-VDE and for the cohort, the LD4P cohort. And in many ways, this is a much closer approximation to the LRM, where they have the work, expression, manifestation, and item. Now we have superwork, work, instance, and item. There's a few obvious differences, but it's critical to note here that this was not done specifically to align with RDA or LRM, but developed from apparent need. And I suppose in this way, there's some external validation of theory from LRM, but we should still keep some of the differences in mind. So one of the other groups that's formed more recently is the Cluster Knowledge Base Editor Working Group. And they've been charged with reviewing the Cluster Knowledge Base Interaction or Editor document, which is really a series of use cases and outlining processes for two key tasks that they're looking at and trying to figure out. One is the creation of what you'd think of as a cataloging editor or cataloging tool for working with Share-VDE data. It'd be interesting to see how that compares to processes with Sinopia. The other thing is just looking at the overall maintenance of the cluster knowledge base. So how URIs are maintained with time, how persistence is kept in order, and so forth, and a variety of different automated processes. One of the other groups is the Authority and Identifier Management Working Group, which is really tasked at looking at authority work with URIs, in MARC, but also thinking about how that can work in BIBFRAME. And this, I just have a screen capture of the table for SVDE in terms of the available external URI sources that can be used for enrichment purposes. I know that one of the recommendations from the Transformation Council that Jackie noted was having some alignment and communication with LD4 for some of this, but it's also really interesting to think about some of the other international members and what different vocabularies will be used as things internationalize more and more, and what different vocabularies might be utilized. Then this is just a sample of a process map of looking at how Share-VDE could be used as an authority tool. This is perhaps focusing more on how those URIs could be used in more current systems, but it'll be really interesting to hear from that group over the coming months in terms of authority processes, both in MARC using some of the URIs that are being generated, but also in the BIBFRAME data. So mapping new processes for doing similar things in Share-VDE. And finally, there's the Discovery UX and UI working group. Thank you. There we go. And we've had this for the early prototype for the Share-VDE portal for a little while, since the initial 1985 and 2015 imprint data was released. That's currently up and on the web so people can explore with it. And this just gives a snapshot of how some of the various elements are connected. It'll be nice to see the full collection data from various institutions go in there soon. But the UX UI group has been working on sort of improving that. A prototype of use for the user interface is being worked on for like a new iteration of it for the end of the calendar year. And the SVDE UX UI working group was working along with Samheim, a UX company, to try to pool feedback from member institutions and staff that are including some input, I believe, from students within the various institutions to see how the discovery experience could be improved. But it's still really early days, so it's interesting to think how our discovery environments that are based on MARC-based systems might evolve with time as we have new types of data. But just to give a few examples, here we see an interface showing, or like an agent interface, I suppose, for William Shakespeare with some added contextual data about him. You can also look at original works by Shakespeare, original works about him in the navigation, related people, related original works, and navigate from there. Similarly, if you're looking through like a work-based search, you can look at library-held publications of given works, like Hamlet, or related original works, and so on. And you can drill down to the holdings from a specific institution and link out to actually track down that item that you want to check out, I guess. But for now, we still have the current portal, which soon we'll have the full institution data being maintained and kept up to date for participating institutions. And it'll be fascinating to see this in practice for so many reasons, generally to test practices, but also to see what different relationships surface. And where will we go from here? Well, there's going to need to be a lot of further analysis and review of conversion specifications, then again, providing feedback to the Library of Congress in terms of the ongoing development of BIBFRAME. Analysis of primary resource clustering, thinking about those works and superworks and how well the different clusters fit. Developing the development of methods to clean up clusters further, thinking about post-conversion. Establishing authority and identifier profiles. Creating tools and techniques for data creation and maintenance while maintaining the integrity and permanence of identifiers. So as you start sort of aggregating existing identifiers, pulling them apart, doing cataloging work as we're used to doing in current environments, what does that mean for the persistence of the URIs that are related to them in the knowledge base? That'll be an interesting thing to follow up on the cluster knowledge base management group with. Establishing workflows for the use of the cluster knowledge base by the wider library community for wider or maximum impact. Work on sharing our experiences, both with the PCC, but also with the wider community. Application of workflows for the LD4P cohort. And in general, to facilitate the implementation of linked data in libraries, determining appropriate processes for data flow Of course, a lot of effort has gone into MARC to BIBFRAME thus far, but at some point there'll need to be conversations about BIBFRAME to MARC and how that works for various institutions. What the original source of data would be, when we're talking about there, is where will we have our catalogers actually catalog, do their work. And the list goes on, but so does the work. And what's been fascinating about this is the continued, with this project for me anyway, has been the continued improvement with iteration. On the one hand, there's been continual experimentation and continual work, but at the same time, we have something very concrete to show for it and something to really kick the tires with and to move forward with, which is fascinating. And with that, thank you and look forward to your questions.
All right, thanks, Ian. That was great. And again, we apologize for the technical difficulties we had there. Hopefully it didn't throw any of you off too much. It looks like all of our attendees did make it back into the webinar. So we have had a couple questions come in so far. The first one is, could you please discuss the differences between the Share-VDE and the LRM entity model?
Yeah, I think if in terms of the primary entities, maybe as a starting point, I mean, one of the critical differences might be to look at, whereas the super work relates to a BIBFRAME work in Share-VDE. In LRM, you've got a work and expression. So I'm not sure about maybe that's something to be tested in the future, but the efficacy of having a separate cluster just for expression level elements. And that's, I suppose, one of the critical differences here in terms of function. LRM is also a bit broader, so in terms of defining things rather than focusing on necessarily a specific data model. So there's some flexibility perhaps in how that could map to this current outline, but I think that would be one of the major differences. Jackie, anything to add?
No, Ian, I think that you did an excellent job of explaining that. I think you've said it before, but we did review LRM in the process of proposing the super work in the model, just to see how it could fit or would fit in that conceptual framework. But I think that you've covered the major differences.
Yeah, I suppose the other side of that argument is that the BIBFRAME, like the current LC BIBFRAME model, then kind of just brings in work and expression level elements together, which I think in some ways makes a lot of sense rather than leaving the expression level elements as a separate cluster per se. But then what's missing is that higher level to sort of hang off of to aggregate various different similar works, which was the need that we tried to fill with the super work.
Yeah, that level of abstraction is both confusing and necessary. I mean, the abstraction between the work and the expression, and I feel like that we did a reasonably good job discussing why not having the expression represented in the BIBFRAME as LC implemented it is okay if we could also have a super work.
Great, thanks. And just a little logistical comment. I did see someone in the audience had their hand raised through GoTo. If you could go ahead and instead type your question into the question panel, and then we can get to that. So the next question is more related to just BIBFRAME. Is there a mapping out there that we're able to view or use between RDA elements and BIBFRAME parts?
The conversion specs at the Library of Congress are useful, but I don't believe they work on RDA rule by rule. It's more conceptual than that, in that it doesn't map from a descriptive standard to a carrier standard. So because RDA discusses what to record for a resource and not how to record it, or where to record it, I should say, I don't believe there's any model that maps RDA straight into BIBFRAME, because we're talking carriers of data rather than descriptive standards for data.
Yeah, I think a really useful tool for that is some of the work that the different PCC groups did in BIBFRAME to RDA core. There's a BIBFRAME to RDA core mapping document, or BIBCO to RDA core, I think, and similarly a CONSER to BIBFRAME mapping document that were put out.
But are they the standard? Is it the CSR and the BSR, Ian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think another nice lookup is both with the BIBFRAME editor on the BIBFRAME website. I think it includes the RDA rules next to each element.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same is being built into Sinopia, but then, as each institution adapts Sinopia for its own application profiles, then, how people do that or how they have it visualized could vary.
Yeah. Yeah. So I remember I do know that those are in those tools. I guess I was hoping for a pointer to an overall mapping, and I don't think there is. I think you have to look at it in the tools element by element.
Yeah.
As Ian said.
Yeah, that would be something that I would love to see some more coordination on in terms of the RDA toolkit, to see some of those mappings be created there, because it's a natural next step. If BIBFRAME's to be the replacement for MARC, then presumably the RDA toolkit should have the same mappings that we have for MARC in the toolkit.
That's it.
That's
All right, thank you. So another BIBFRAME question. Are all the groups and institutions that are already working a bit with BIBFRAME using the same version, or are there multiple versions of BIBFRAME?
I think technically there's BIBFRAME and BIBFRAME 2.0. If institutions have created a localization of BIBFRAME, then there's more than that. But there's no, I don't believe, any consensus or coordination around which iteration of BIBFRAME is in use. I think most people are probably using 2.0 at this point because it would be akin to using whatever came before MARC 21 instead of MARC 21.
Yeah, there are different flavors, which, I mean, Share-VDE itself can be considered another flavor of BIBFRAME in terms of some of the changes that have been made to it.
Yeah, so there's flavors of conversion too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Similar, I think the National Library of Sweden's version is, it's based on BIBFRAME too, but they've got their own, made their own adjustments to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, and then we have time for one more question, and we're going to stick with BIBFRAME. Do the BIBFRAME tools that you're building allow for the importing of metadata elements from non-library sources?
Ian, I think that this is true, but correct me. I think that the tools themselves are open because to non-MARC data, to non-MARC structured data, as long as the data is structured and can be mapped into a profile, which is needed, and a template record. But I haven't actually done any of that. Have you, Ian?
I haven't, no. It's something that we wanted to test here at the University of Alberta as one of our next steps, because we're working on the implementation of BIBFRAME, not just through the SVDE project, but and sort of connecting our various collections is one of the things that we wanted to test next. Now, this could be something that would be worth following up with the Transformation Council writ large, because my understanding is that there's been like art projects and ongoing and so forth that other metadata formats have been tested, but I'm not sure about the status.
Yeah, I think it's on our, I do believe that looking into other ontologies or other institutions' metadata is in our parking lot for the Transformation Council.
Yeah, I mean, keeping in mind that we're two presenters, but there's a number of the different working groups that we've talked about, right? So if there's some questions that we'd be happy to go back and get answers to follow up from the larger groups, and that's one of them that might make sense.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. This has been such a great session, and that's all the time that we have for questions today. We were glad that everyone could be with us. Thank you to our audience. And again, thank you for your patience when we had our little technical glitch. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form, so if you could take a few minutes to respond to those questions. Your comments are very valuable and do help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. And the email will also include links to today's slide and recording. And you'll have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will be included in the email. Thank you once again to our presenters, Jackie Samples and Ian Bigelow, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Felicity Dykes and Wanda Jazzieri, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. Also thank you to Megan Doherty, who was able to help us get the webinar back up and running when we had our glitch. All of these people, the support they provide, make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS does have other continuing education events coming up. We have 3 more webinar events this season. The next webinar will be Wednesday, May 29th, which will be part 2 in our Standardizing Cereals series, covering counter, sushi, and seru. Please see the ALCTS website to register or to find more information on these. And ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on July 23rd, discussing streaming media collections. Again, check the website for information on these upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this will conclude our session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.